Education and leadership. It is a big deal. If we're going to have any discussion about education and how to improve the public schools, a primary issue that we have to tackle is that of leadership. What role should an effective leader play in our schools? And what effect can that leadership have on the success in the public school system? Now, these are very difficult questions to answer, and you have a lot of really bright people on both sides of this argument. You have some that say that the principle that leads the least is the principle that leads the best. You also have those that say that leadership really doesn't make that big of a difference because there are too many societal factors that are at play in determining whether or not a child is able to learn. The leadership within the school and the managing of the school, actually, it makes very little difference there. But I'm here to say that we've learned too much about the role of leaders in successful schools to underestimate the part that they play. So today we're going to talk about leadership, and specifically a type of leadership that's been shown to have a great effect on school achievement. And we call this model instructional leadership. So before we go into what actually instructional leadership is and how to define it, first I think it's important that we give a brief history of how instructional leadership develops. Now, we can say instructional leadership had its origins in the 1960s, when the U.S. Department of Education commissioned a man named James Coleman to conduct a study regarding the effectiveness of the American public school system. Now, this was a massive study. At the time, was the largest study the federal government had ever commissioned on education. This report was called the Quality of Educational Opportunity Report, but it would become known throughout the field simply as the Coleman Report. Now, in this report, which was released in 1966, the primary findings indicated that the determining factor involved in students' ability to learn and succeed in the schools was the students' family background and economic background. The study indicated that the schools and other characteristics such as leadership and investment actually had much less to do with the students' actual ability to learn. The report concluded that those poorer students did not receive the adequate support from their family unit that gave them the tools or the skills necessary to succeed in the school system, and that the management and leadership within the school would have very little effect on them. Now, as you can imagine, this report was very controversial. It was refuted by many scholars in the field of education. Now, by the late 70s and early 80s, a large body of educational research was being conducted to refute the Coleman Report. Now, this group of researchers was led by a man named Ronald E. Edmonds. He was the director for the Center of Urban Studies at Harvard University. Now, the goal of these researchers was to set out to look for schools in poor neighborhoods with poor students to find out if there were, in fact, schools under these circumstances where the children were able to learn and able to have success. It was quickly determined that there were many schools with poor majority student populations where those poor students were actually able to learn and have a great deal of success. Now, this type of research and the research that would come after it would become known as the effective schools movement. The goal of the effective school movement was to study those schools in the poor neighborhoods and distinguish the schools where the students were having success from the schools where the students were not having success, and to determine what characteristics separated the successful schools from the unsuccessful schools. Now, this research determined that there were several characteristics that were possessed by the successful schools, and these successful characteristics became known as effective school correlates. Now, a primary and very important correlate of effective schools was a certain type of leadership characteristics that were exhibited by the principal. Now, these leadership characteristics would become known as instructional leadership qualities. So what are these characteristics that make up an instructional leader? First, these principles should be culture builders. They should create a culture of education and learning at the school in which each member of the organization knows and is dedicated to that primary purpose. These principles are also goal-oriented. They have a clear vision of where they want their schools to go, and this is related throughout the school. Now, these goals are primarily based on academic success from the students, and these principles are uncompromising and seeing that these goals are met. These principals not only engage in leadership through goal setting and motivation, but they themselves are very involved in the technical aspects of teaching and learning. They're hands-on managers who actually work with the teachers in developing curriculum and instructional methods, as well as seeing that the students are actually learning. The characteristics of instructional leadership were further explained by Hallinger and Murphy in 1985. They broke instructional leadership down into 3 dimensions: defining the school's mission, managing the instructional program, and promoting a positive school learning climate. The first dimension, defining the school's mission, is further delineated into 2 functions: framing the school's goals and communicating those goals to the rest of the school. The school should have a clear vision for the future and measurable goals that each and every member of the school knows and is invested in. The second dimension, managing the instructional program. Now this can be broken down further into 3 functions. The principal should supervise and evaluate the instruction, coordinate the curriculum, and monitor student progress. In this role, the instructional leader becomes a hands-on manager and is responsible for seeing that students are being taught the necessary skills, as well as seeing that those students are actually learning those skills. The third dimension, promoting a positive school learning climate, includes several functions: protecting instructional time, promoting professional development, maintaining high visibility, providing incentives for teachers, developing high expectations and standards, and providing incentives for learning. Okay, so now we have a good understanding of what instructional leadership is. Now at this point, we're in the mid to late 1980s. We have a ton of research on what makes for effective schools. So what happens next? Well, what happens next, of course, is the government gets involved. And like governments always do when they think they have an answer to a problem, they take this idea of instructional leadership, they categorize it, they code it, they file it, they put it in a box, they market instructional leadership, and they try to ship it to every part of the country. So they took this research and this form of leadership that was very successful in certain contexts at turning around ineffective schools, and they believed that they had found their silver bullet to cure every educational problem in the country. The federal government would then go on to set up school leadership academies in every state with the goal of promoting instructional leadership. So like history has shown us over and over and over again, a one-size-fits-all approach is rarely, if ever, successful. And very quickly the reality would catch up with the theory of instructional leadership. So let's fast forward a bit into the 1990s and we start to see the cracks of instructional leadership get bigger and bigger. Of course, we know schools are very different places, and therefore the kind of leadership that they require will also be very different. There's no way that any one type of leadership could work best in every school. Also, principals are very, very busy people, and they have to dedicate a great deal of their time to the administrative aspects of school. Now, most principals, they simply do not have the time to monitor every aspect of the educational processes of a school. Also, we have to remember that many principals don't have the expertise to instruct teachers on proper teaching methods. I mean, it's very hard for a principal whose background is in English literature to tell an organic chemist the best way to teach chemistry. So now we're seeing some of the problems that led to a decline in influence from the instructional leadership theory. Now by this time, much of the educational academic community had begun to place more importance on other leadership theories, such as transformational leadership and teacher-centered leadership. So now instructional leadership is quite hurt. They're down, they got a cut above their eye, they're bleeding out. It looks like they might not be able to go on. But just when it looks like they're down for the count, wait a minute, here comes the educational reform movement of the 21st century. In the early 2000s, Closing the achievement gap became the primary goal of educational reform in the United States. Now, this created a rekindling of interest in the effect of school research. In 2001, President George Bush signed into law the No Child Left Behind Act, and the focus of education became accountability and achievement standards. With these new reforms, instructional leadership was back to the forefront of educational policy. Except this time, the academic field had addressed some of those original problems